welcome. In this video on the United States Civil War, we will look at 1862. Last time we talked about the disaster for the Union that happened at the first major battle at First Bull Run in July of 1861. After this battle, Lincoln replaces his top commander of the Army of the Potomac, who was Irvin McDowell. He was replaced by George McClellan, and McClellan began to take this group of volunteers and turn them into an army. He would spend months drilling and preparing these men with everything they needed to know to be good soldiers. His weakness was in moving. McClellan didn't just spend weeks or months, but the better part of a year preparing his army to fight, which, being a Union commander, the Union has all the pressure on it to win. And so if they sit back and raise a large army that is doing nothing at that point to contribute to a victory in the Civil War, Lincoln urges him, pushes him, goads him, finally gets McClellan to act, but McClellan decides that, and uses all of his army expertise. See, McClellan is a West Point man. He's been to War College. He knows and claims to know that he has a much better understanding of grand strategy than Lincoln does. So McClellan's plan is, rather than to attack directly towards Richmond, you see, here's Washington, D.C., and here's Manassas Junction, and the original plan had been to push through Manassas, through Fredericksburg, and straight at Richmond. McClellan said that's the most foolish thing he'd ever heard, that Lincoln didn't know strategy. And so a better plan would be to float his army down the Potomac and land on the York-James Peninsula, and then to race up the peninsula and seize Richmond from behind. That way he could avoid trying to fight through the Confederate entrenchments that they'd had at Manassas and Fredericksburg, and who were bracing for a Union attack. To Lincoln, this seemed a bit foolish, because then it would be dividing the Union Army. They would have to leave troops in the Shenandoah Valley, they'd have to leave troops defending Washington, and they'd send their main army far away. And Lincoln believed it was a greater risk that the Confederates might take Washington than the Union might seize Richmond. But after McClellan put his plan for the umpteenth time, Lincoln consented, and McClellan went forward with this peninsular campaign, which we'll return to in just a moment. Also in 1862, the Union blockade really begins to take effect. They begin to block up Charleston, was seen as a great place to target first. Also New Orleans. And at New Orleans, they're able to defeat the city defenses. The equivalent from 1812 would be Fort McHenry. The forts protecting New Orleans were defeated, and the Union Navy was able to press right up into New Orleans, and rather than risk the city being destroyed and shelled and bombarded, the Confederates backed out of New Orleans, and the Union landed troops in the largest city of the Confederacy. Early in 1862, New Orleans, the largest city in the South, fell to the Union and would remain in Union hands the entire rest of the war. We'll return to that also later in the video and in future videos about the effect of New Orleans having already fallen to the Union so early in the war. Also, the Civil War sees the development of ironclad ships. You'll see the gist of this in the video. We'll watch part of Ken Burns' Civil War, and you will have a good description of this. For the first time, they began bolting iron plates onto wooden steamboats and fighting, and they basically made any wooden Navy ship obsolete. Eventually, they build all iron ships without the wood underneath, but this is started in 1862 and becomes the norm for navies from then on. You also see the Confederate response to the blockade, which is to outfit these blockade runners, steamboats as fast as they could possibly go, to try to break through the Union blockade. Early in the war, blockade running and trying to get trade through the Union blockade was somewhat successful. It would grow by the end to be very difficult to get through. Okay, the war in the West. In the West, out in Kentucky and Tennessee, you see the rise of General Ulysses S. Grant, and he grows to fame after the battles at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson and the Battle of Shiloh. This is commanding General William Henry Wager Halleck, General Halleck. If you see this zoom-in map here, you see this is the tip of Illinois at Cairo, Illinois, and you've got Kentucky, which had declared neutrality, which is why the Confederacy had been building these forts here, Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, on the Tennessee side. These are actually pretty poor spots for a fort. There would have been better spots up here in Kentucky, but Kentucky was neutral. They were unable to build these fortifications there. So when the war broke out, the Confederate troops began building forts to hold off the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers so that the Union could not use them as highways of attack to plunge into the South. They had these forts stocked with cannons to prevent any Union ships from going past as a main way to defend the Confederacy. General Grant had seized Columbus, Kentucky, with a small army and was in command of the forces tasked with seizing Fort Henry and Fort Donelson to allow Union gunboats to go up and down the Tennessee and Cumberland River, which would likely open the way to the major city and rail hub of Clarksville, Tennessee, as well as even the capital, Nashville. Further zoomed in here with the Tennessee River and the Cumberland River. Here's Fort Henry, not McHenry, Fort Henry, and Fort Donelson over here. What you had at Fort Henry, again, I mentioned it was a bad site for a fort. The flooding, due to the seasonal flooding, actually rendered Fort Henry almost undefensible, and when Grant's forces arrived with gunboat support on the river, they basically abandoned Fort Henry without hardly a fight. Those troops retreated and joined them at Fort Donelson. Grant marched his men over to lay siege to Donelson. It took a while for his gunboats to go back up the Tennessee to the Mississippi and then up down the Cumberland River from the Ohio. And with the gunboat support, they actually got beaten up a little bit by the cannons at Fort Donelson, but the Confederates were surrounded. Like other battles we've talked about, though, the Confederates had roughly even numbers with Grant, and they asked Grant what terms he would give. Grant asked one of his subordinates, who said, "No terms to the damned rebels." And so Grant said unconditional surrender was what he wanted from Fort Donelson. Some of the subordinates at Fort Donelson were not pleased with the fact they made a little attempt to escape. They couldn't break through, and rather than have a terribly bloody fight, the people at Fort Donelson, the Confederates, gave unconditional surrender. Not before some of them, such as, I believe, Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was a Confederate cavalry commander, escaped over the river at night with part of his command and refused to surrender and actually got away. And so this makes Grant terribly, terribly famous, this victory at Fort Donelson, which is one of the bigger victories of the war so far in early 62, I believe in February. Grant presses the attack further into Tennessee, and he powers down the Tennessee River and lands, if I can go back to this map, lands near Corinth, Mississippi. This is a major rail network. You see, after taking Fort Henry, he floats all the way down the Tennessee and lands here. He's awaiting other troops who were up in Ohio to take the river and land in his back under General Don Carlos Buell. And so he's camped out here at Shiloh, preparing for reinforcements to attack and take Corinth, Mississippi, which would cut a vital rail junction for the South and would basically begin the process of cutting off the Confederacy. Opposing Grant, here's the Tennessee River, opposing Grant at Shiloh is General Albert Sidney Johnston, with a large Confederate force that was equal to Grant's. But if he were to wait 2 or even maybe 1 day, he would be outnumbered 2-1 once Don Carlos Buell's forces would arrive. And so at the Battle of Shiloh, Albert Sidney Johnston launches an all-out attack. There's not a lot of tactics here. They come out of a wooded area. Grant's men are only partially prepared for a major attack like this, and it is a terrible 1-day battle where the Grant's forces barely hold. Many of his forces tumble back to the Tennessee River By nightfall, only a fraction of the men are able to hold their ground, but in the midst of the fighting, General Albert Sidney Johnston, the Confederate commander, is shot and killed. With the loss of their overall commander, and within the night, the overnight arrival of additional forces under Buell doubled, or nearly doubled, the Union forces, and so the Confederates retreat much further south towards Corinth, Mississippi, to live to fight another day. That's the Battle of Shiloh. Returning back to the east in 1862, you have McClellan goes forward with his Peninsular Campaign as they land on the peninsula to race up towards Richmond. But he goes incredibly slow. He earns the nickname the Virginia Creeper as they begin, every time they come up to a small outfit of Confederate troops, he brings up his heavy cannons, he digs his own trenches, he prepares for a big attack, and the Confederates fall back a couple of miles. McClellan declares victory, and he creeps forward. And so he gives up virtually any advantage he had of achieving surprise. As he advances finally up toward Richmond, he's embarrassed again by the Confederate cavalry commander, Jeb Stuart, who is able with his Confederate cavalry to ride all the way around McClellan's army uncaught, and able to reconnoiter and scout out McClellan's entire force and position and disposition. Also during this time, the famous General Stonewall Jackson fights against 3 Union armies in the Shenandoah Valley, in what's called his Shenandoah Valley campaign, going up and down and up the Shenandoah Valley, threatening Washington, D.C., and tying down several other armies. So you have General Jackson against Union Commander Fremont, Banks, and McDowell fighting a series of battles up and down this valley, only ever fighting one of them at a time. Meanwhile, McClellan is down here just coming off the peninsula threatening Richmond. So Stonewall Jackson is able to tie down nearly 100,000 troops up here that could have been used to help pressure Richmond at this very early point. So what you see is McClellan then is threatening laying siege to Richmond. The President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, asks Robert E. Lee where they should go when they abandon Richmond. And the new commander, Robert E. Lee, says Richmond will not fall. We will attack. He'll take his smaller force and attack a larger force, what was thought to be ridiculous. But it pays off. McClellan, who was laying siege to Richmond, gets hit on the flank by Lee. And the Union lines hold at Mechanicsville. But he falls back and digs new trenches. Lee attacks again, and the lines hold. And each of these battles, Lee in almost every battle is taking more casualties, and in only one of these did the Union lines even break a little bit. Remember, McClellan spent almost a year training these men. These are good soldiers. So the Union lines hold, McClellan orders retreat. The Union lines hold, and they hurt Lee's army, and they retreat. Union lines hold, Union lines hold, but McClellan orders retreat until his troops are within range of his gunboats on the river, able to protect and provide extra artillery fire before Lee stops. This is called the Battle of the 7 Days. They fight effectively 7 battles in 7 days, and it embarrasses McClellan. He thinks he's been outgeneraled by Lee. Lee takes terrible casualties in so doing. Only really won one of the battles of 7 days, yet McClellan orders a retreat after every one. McClellan was disgusted by the bloodshed of these terrible battles, such as these, and he knew that Grant, who had won very narrowly, but had won the Battle of Shiloh, but so many men had been killed at Shiloh that Grant had actually been removed from his post and put on desk duty. McClellan, fearing what happened to McDowell when he lost the Battle of Bull Run, fearing what happened to Grant, who actually won the Battle of Shiloh, and maybe out of a personal humanitarian sense that he didn't like to see the spilling of blood in war, retreated rather than fight these hard-fought battles. He will then be ordered by Lincoln to return to Washington, which is where we'll pick up next time. Thanks for watching.